Good day. My name is Michael Malondo, and I'm going to present on the subject of Psychological Counseling 2, code PC20D2. I'm going to present the subject in two parts. The first part will be the preparation for the exam, and then I'm also going to discuss how you have to prepare yourself before the examination, and then also during the examination what you need to be aware of. Then the second part of the presentation will then look at the content of the subject itself as a scope for the exam and as a guideline, and I'm going to explain more when I reach the second part of this presentation. Now, very important that for the exam you need to give you at least ample time to prepare yourself, preferably 2 months before you're going to write your exam, just to come up with a timetable. Remember, you've got more than one subjects that you might write for exams, and it will help you if you are prepared for the exam. So there are 3 things you have to do. The first thing is you read through your whole subjects, the chapters, firstly to understand. Then secondly, while you are reading through this, you have to make notes in order to remember the keywords, and then also remember the concept with all those keywords. And then thirdly, revision, which is very important, where you will then look at your notes which you have made during your reading preparation, and that will prepare you for your exam. So during the exam, there are 4 things that you have to do when you have the exam paper in front of you. Read through the exam questions, make sure you read all of them. Then secondly is you select the ones that you can answer, which are the easiest one. And then thirdly, those that you have been selected, you can then also read through it in order to understand the question. Then lastly is answer the question, and don't interpret or assume this is what the question is all about. So that's with regard to the preparation of the exam. So I'm quickly going to go through the content of your paper. Now, as I said earlier also, is the purpose of this presentation is to give you guidance to help you to prepare for the examination. You are still requested to prepare accordingly, to read through the whole subject, through the whole chapters, so that you can make sure that you are ready for the examination. Now, the first thing is for the subject is the issue of ethics. Now, you have to understand that when you are a counselor and you're conducting a counseling session, you need to adhere to certain principles, and there are ethical and legal principles that you have to adhere to. You are actually bound as a counselor. Now, in your examination or in your submission of your answer is you have to explore the 2 different principles, and then you have to explain how does these 2 principles play, what role does it play when it comes to counseling. Then you can also discuss the challenges of these 2 principles or the application of these 2 principles in a counseling session, and how you can actually look at this. Now, preferably it will be very good if you can differentiate the 2 different principles. You first look at the ethical principle. What does the ethical principle look at? The legality of those principles. And then, of course, you can also bring in the issue of other principles that are being used when it comes to ethics. And how does the law actually bind you or oblige you to make sure that you adhere to this principle. So as a counselor, you need to be aware about what is expected from you, and you must also then discuss in detail what you might expect. So make sure that these principles are well spelled, are well explained, and you know exactly what these principles are all about. Now, many times that you find yourself that counselors, they find them in a position where they violate these principles. Now, also in your discussion, discuss a little bit on in a case where a counselor violates this principle. What does a counselor do? What is a counselor supposed to do to make sure that he or she does not violate these principles? And so principles are there to guide and to protect the counselor and the client or the counselee also. So in your discussion, bring out those aspects of protection and the relationship between the counselor and the counselee, and how this relationship can be strengthened by using these principles. Then, of course, we're going to look at VCT, which is the voluntary counseling and testing, how important it is. I've mentioned this so many times. I've also make a reference to it in the past, so I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but it would be very good if you bring out, discuss pre-test counseling, post-test counseling, and ongoing HIV counseling as part of your VCT. And then also talk about the challenges of VCTs. And also one of the things that you can look at in the Namibian context is the absence of VCT, why and how that can impact actually the prevalence of HIV within a country. Then, of course, in the psychological counseling, you will also need to talk about the different cultures, and one of the cultures that I'm giving an example, because you've got the Greek culture, you've got the medieval culture, and then you also have the Roman culture, then you've got the Asian path culture, the Asian path theory, which you can use, where they also talk about their own culture. Now, since HIV/AIDS is a sexual it's transmitted through sexual behavior. Now, in your Roman culture, you have to look at the whole issue of how did the Roman society during the medieval perceive sexuality, and what are their knowledge on sexuality. And in this you can also discuss in detail what was the definition of sexuality for the Roman culture, and how they perceive it. And then you can also talk about how it is being used currently, and how it can be used currently, and then how it's being excuse me perceived currently. So it is very important that when you're going to look at the Roman culture and you look at the sexual behavior, you also need to discuss the practices of their knowledge. And then, as part of the Roman culture, you're also going to look at the unsafe sexual behavior and practices they had during this time. And now remember, those were the most difficult time, and there were a lot of philosophical and traditional and cultural influence when it came to the behavior of those people. So discuss it in detail. How does the Roman behavior had an influence on the sexual practices, and how does this culture still being used in our modern culture? So in your discussion or submission, compare the two cultures, look at the Roman culture, and then you also look at the modern culture. So you can also bring in, compare the Roman culture with the Asian culture, and compare them in the light of sexual behavior and practices. Now, as I said earlier, that your culture and your norms can have so much influence in behavior of people. Now, what makes today in the 21st century, in the modern age where we are now, what make people, do people behave the same like in the Roman culture or during the Roman era, or are they still behaving this? Are they behaving differently, or are they still behaving the same? So this is where you have to discuss this in detail. You know, how did the Roman culture still entrench our modern culture? And what role it really play, and how you can prevent it. So these are something that you have to look at as much as possible. And then, of course, the other thing is the testing part. Now, when you remember, we talk about volunteer counseling and testing. Now, when we look at the testing, you have to look at, number one, what is HIV testing? That's number one. Number two, you have to look at the different ways of testing. You've got rapid testing, you've got the ELISA testing, you've got the diagnostical testing. So you've got so many kinds of testing, which is just an example. But you have to discuss now in detail. When somebody goes for a HIV test, what kind of test do they go? What results can they expect? What time? And then also discuss the advantages and disadvantages of HIV testing. What advantages does it have to someone or to an individual to know what your status is through this testing? And then also discuss the whole controversial issue of self-testing. How controversial is self-testing, which means you can go to a pharmacy, you can buy a test kit, and you can test yourself at home. There is so much controversial, so many discussion about self-test kits that some people say it is an advantage, some of people feel it's a disadvantage. So there are so many reasons why you have to discuss this. What if you find out that you are HIV positive? You can commit suicide, or you can do something irresponsible. So this is something that you can also discuss and bring up in your preparation. So as I say, the purpose of this presentation is not a repetition of the content. It's just to give you guidelines, guidance for you to prepare for your examination. So it is still expected from you to read other resources or other sources as part of your preparation for your examination. So when you look at HIV positive test and you compare to your VCT or your volunteer counseling test, you might be able to come up with very good examples. Now, in HIV positive tests, remember the ethical and legal principles that we have talked earlier, because during that time is when you go through the testing, your counselor plays a very important role. Now, depends on your status or the outcome of your results. The role that your counselor is playing is so important, and in your examination or your submission, you also need to discuss that things in detail. And of course, the question that most people are asking is, what role does counseling play when it comes to HIV? And as I repeat again so much, because just to look at the whole VCT, volunteer counseling and testing, people are going to counseling because of their results or because of their status. People want to go to be tested to know their status, and part of the whole testing process, counseling plays a very pivotal role or important role. So discuss that in detail, break it down. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages of counseling? How do you link counseling and HIV? What role can counseling play when it comes to HIV/AIDS? Very important that you have to cover that. And then, of course, the other way or methodology of counseling is what we call couple counseling. Now, just to explain and to revise the process again, you go for a pre-test, post-test counseling. And then during this counseling, especially the pre-test, the question will be, if you are being found positive, would you like your couple or your spouse or your partner to come in as part of the counseling? After, when you do your post-test counseling, after your results have been known, then this question is also asked, would you mind to bring in your partner to go through the same test or to go through the counseling? And once there is this mutual consent and the client give his or her consent, then both partner will then come to the counseling session where the counselor will then discuss and talk to the couple. So it's very important that couple counseling is the most important part, especially when it comes to premarital counseling. Many couples are getting married and they never went through a counseling session, and they found themselves that after the marriage or the wedding, that one of them discovered that they are HIV positive, or maybe they've got any other diseases. So couple counseling plays a very important role, and couple counseling is not just limited to HIV/AIDS. Couple counseling covers a whole spectrum of subjects, from family planning up to management of the household, the finance. So many subjects can be covered during the couples counseling. So it's very important that during this time that the couple has to go for counseling so that they can prepare themselves, and then to prepare them, empower themselves, especially when they want to go for a wedding or they want to get married. Then ongoing HIV counseling, as I said, it's something that you always go through. After you went through the pre-test and post-test counseling, you go through, then this is also part of your clinical monitoring, where if your status unknown and you're on ARV, that as you go on an ongoing basis to your medical practitioner, your doctor, to look at your viral load or your CD4 count, then it's very important that during the time that that you have to go through counseling. So counseling does play a very important role when it comes to HIV/AIDS, and you have to look this and discuss this in detail. So it's very, very much more important that you have to look at this different thing on HIV counseling and so on. So that's with regard to the HIV psychological counseling. So I hope that this presentation has helped you and will be a guidance for the preparation of your exam. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.